A World History of Christianity, Chapter 12, Part 2. We are on page 471. The Unenlightened. As long ago as 1939, an historian of the Enlightenment observed that virtually no scholarly attention had been paid to conservative and reactionary thinkers of the 18th century, those people who disagreed with the positions so emphatically put forward by the philosophes on questions of religion. In the picture we usually receive of the Enlightenment, he mused, certain bold and progressive men who are outlined with great distinctiveness do battle with vague but powerful adversaries, who are rarely described but are indicated as extremely unenlightened. The criticism still seems every bit as valid today. Although their views are seldom given and erring, a large number of 18th century Christians disagreed absolutely with the point of view of the philosophers. Among these dissenters from prevailing opinion were traditionalists, whose understanding of the faith remained more or less unchanged in the new climate, but who were willing to enter into debate with the philosophers, and newer groups whose refusal to engage with enlightened thought drove them to what might today be described as fundamentalist positions. Of the first group, perhaps the most vocal were conservative Catholic thinkers in France, who argued that the philosophes were fundamentally misguided and even dishonest in their arguments. Accepting that faith could in principle be reconciled with reason, they argued that anti-clericals who claimed reason and empirical knowledge as their guides were in practice relying upon common sense prejudice rather than advancing philosophically valid positions. Central to the arguments of these apologists for orthodoxy was one irreducible piece of evidence to which there seemed ample testimony in Scripture: the fact of the incarnation. Eschewing natural religion with its tendency toward deist reductionism, conservatives like A. de Malvin de Montazet, Archbishop of Lyons, were quick to admit that revelation is the sole foundation of our faith, but defended revealed truth as based on facts which we consider to be as indubitable as any that history reports. The supposedly enlightened, he argued, far from being impartial, were clouded by prejudices of the very kind they deplored in others. Rather than examining the historical evidence for miracles with genuine objectivity, they simply asserted that miracles were impossible on the grounds that they had not witnessed any, taking it as an article of faith that the laws of nature could never be suspended. Were the philosophers really interested in establishing the truth rather than simply finding a stick with which to beat the Catholic Church? They would not presume to know more than their evidence could support, nor would they resort to anecdote, burlesque, and vulgarity to amuse the fops of Paris. Defenders of Catholic orthodoxy who entered into debate with the philosophers characteristically stressed that it was the testimony of history, not the natural sciences, which offered the surest guide to truth. History, rather than natural philosophy, appeared to support the notion that it was the Catholic Church which preserved the faith once delivered to the saints through its conservatism of doctrine. Over the particularly contentious issue of miracles, for example, Orthodox Catholics argued that there existed no positive scientific evidence to discount reports of miracles in the past, whereas there was a great body of historical writing to attest to their reality. The onus, therefore, seemed to be on those who wished to disprove, rather than to prove, the supernatural. When the philosophers retaliated by pointing to similar claims of the miraculous, which were made by non-Catholic heretics and infidels, apologists for Catholicism like Nicholas Sylvester Bergier, 1718-90, priest of Besancon, were led into the position of stoutly maintaining that genuine miracles could only be performed by the Orthodox, and that all other historical or contemporary claims were the result of deliberate frauds. As Robert Palmer has pointed out, such a defensive position could lead to absurdly anachronistic portrayals of the apostles and saints of Scripture as cool and impartial observers who, like their idealized 18th century counterparts, accepted reports of the supernatural only after the most searching and exhaustive of empirical tests. This was a position which it was not difficult for anti-clerical philosophers to ridicule. Not all apologists for Christian orthodoxy tried to shift the terms of the debate from one which stressed the uniformity of natural laws to one which focused on the problems of historical evidence. An increasingly common response among reasonable Christians was to accept the philosopher's premises, but to increase the sphere of natural religion to include more of traditional Christianity than was usually allowed by the enlightened. This most popular of approaches, which seemed to accommodate the latest philosophical trends, while at the same time maintaining faith, characteristically drew analogies from nature to validate the reality and benign purpose of God's plan for mankind. Seizing on the exciting new theories of microscopists that all matter had existed from the beginning of the world in germ form, intellectually progressive Christians argued that the universal pattern of growth from simple to complex organisms revealed that there was a premeditated purpose in design. Innumerable religio-scientific treatises which appeared throughout the 18th century took this line of argument. Works like the best-selling 8-volume Spectacle of Nature, first published by Abbé Pluche in 1732, Lesser's La Lithothéologie ou la Théologie des Pierres, 1735, and La Théologie des Insectes, 1738, The Theology of Stones, and The Theology of Insects, to name but a few. It is all too easy for the modern reader to be tempted to take sides in the 18th century debate over topics like the possibility of miracles, the grounds for religious knowledge, or the substance and scope of the Christian message, eagerly following, as if at a tennis match, the critiques and rejoinders, points and counterpoints, which were made by anti-clerical philosophers on the one hand and defenders of orthodoxy on the other. In our desire to applaud what may seem like clinching arguments on one side or the other, the amount of common ground between them may easily be overlooked. For although frequently and sometimes bitterly opposed in their conclusions, clerics and anti-clerics came to substantial agreements in their premises and adopted a remarkably similar tone to defend their positions, whether of belief or unbelief in traditional Christianity. Both sides invited reasonable people, possessed only of the capacity to reflect on their experience, to follow the logic of what were presented as unassailable arguments. Both sides claimed to be scrupulous to avoid dogmatic statements or arguments from the authority of tradition alone, and appealed instead to abstractions like reason and nature to convince the ordinary educated reader. It was not only the celebrated philosophes or radical deists whose utterances created the distinctive intellectual atmosphere of the Age of Reason or Enlightenment. Most upholders of Christian orthodoxy who lived and preached in 18th century Europe deserve an equal share of the blame or praise for its pervasive influence. Not everyone shared in this most characteristic and distinctive outlook of the age, however. Even at the high point of the Enlightenment, there were some who went to the heart of the matter by rejecting the authority of reason itself. Groups like the Methodists in Britain, the Jansenists in France, and the Pietists in Germany are often treated as if their dissent from rational religion was simply the exception which proves the rule, as if the philosophers were correct to brand them as out of step with the times, the unfortunate relics of a superstitious past. A more helpful way of understanding these groups would be to see them as genuine dissidents from elite intellectual opinion, whose radicalism was increased, even in part created, by the intolerance implicit in a rationalist monopoly of learned discussion. Jansenism, a spiritual movement within the Catholic Church, which had its origins in the writings of Cornelius Jansen, 1585 through 1638, and owed its organization first to Jean Duverger de Hauranne, the Abbé de Saint-Cyran, 1581 through 1643, and then to Antoine Arnauld, 1612 through 94, was as dangerous to the position of the philosophers as it was to that of Orthodox Christians. From the point of view of traditional Catholics, and particularly the increasingly morally lax Jesuits, Jansenism, which took on an almost Calvinistic approach to predestination, seemed at once too rigorous and pessimistic an outlook to be appropriate to a church whose aim was to save everyone, not only the elect. It was accordingly treated as a heresy, and partly due to Jesuit pressure, formally condemned by the papal bull Unigenitus of 1713. The unpopularity of this measure was later to rebound in the expulsion of the Society of Jesus from Portugal, 1759, France, 1764, and Spain, 1767, and ultimately in the formal dissolution of the Jesuit order in 1773. At the core of Jansenist theology lay a serious criticism which was applicable not only to Catholics but to all those who believed in the compatibility of Christianity with enlightened philosophy. This criticism was that natural religion and natural morality, far from being identical with Christian faith and morals, offered rival pagan systems of belief and ethics. Such a view could hardly have been calculated to be more offensive to the enlightened, whether Christian or deist. It is therefore understandable that when the French government began to persecute Jansenists in earnest from the 1730s, no voice was raised in their defense, even by the supposed champions of religious toleration, as if in illustration of their contempt for the prevailing doctrine of reason. Thousands of Jansenists gathered at the Saint Medard Cemetery in Paris between 1730 and 1732, writhing convulsively, prophesying doom, claiming miracles, and generally disturbing the peace until the cemetery was forcibly closed by the first minister of France, André Hercule de Fleury, 1654 through 1743, who was also a cardinal of the Catholic Church. It is surely revealing of the 18th century climate of opinion that the Orthodox clergy, whose business it was to defend the faith, could be joined by philosophical advocates of religious toleration in ridiculing and condemning the Jansenists. The very existence of these theological and intellectual rebels was an affront to those who felt in their bones that faith should be expounded by means of rational argument and expressed through decorous forms of piety. In England, the comparable thorn in the side of both the established church and enlightened forms of Christianity developed somewhat later in the brand of religion first put forward by the Anglican clergyman John Wesley, 1703 through 91, in the 1730s, and soon derided as Methodism, an insulting term which meant to suggest that the emotionally charged outpourings of its members were merely formulaic. Methodists returned the insult by arguing that Anglicanism was dry, unfeeling, overly intellectual, an unreal creed which had everything to do with social convention and almost nothing to do with the realization of personal salvation offered by Christ through his death on the cross. Wesley's condemnations of the reliance upon natural religion, rationalism, and conventional piety to save souls had been largely inspired by the writings of German pietists and Moravian brethren of the late 17th century, whose arguments, like his own, attempted to renew religious fervor within an established church rather than to overturn it. But whereas pietism gradually took hold in Lutheran churches throughout the German states and spread via German immigrants to America, Methodism in England, like Jansenism in France, was generally derided as enthusiastic, and its adherents presented in polite society as sinister devils or raving lunatics. It was a presage of things to come that even in England and France, where enlightened views had their origins and ran deepest, neither Methodism nor Jansenism could be entirely ignored or was successfully extinguished over the course of the 18th century. The importance of what one might think of as fundamentalist groups, like the Methodists and Jansenists, lay in their tacit but powerful critique of the underlying assumption of the philosophies. Anti-rationalists were potentially far more dangerous enemies than defenders of orthodoxy, who could at least be counted upon to engage in gentlemanly debates which agreed most terms of reference and kept to the subject under discussion. Methodists, who harangued from the pulpit or met in open fields to proclaim the gospel, like Jansenets who writhed convulsively at the St. Medard Cemetery, seemed to be wild, unpredictable folk, rabble-rousers and hysterics who, as often as not, were drawn from the most dangerous ranks of society, those who had least to lose by its overthrow. It is therefore not altogether surprising that the religion of the mob, which they seemed to represent, was generally attacked with satire rather than with reasoned debate, and treated to loathing rather than to measured criticisms, even by those who prided themselves on their universality, toleration, and advocacy of open debate. Another tacit criticism of rational religion came through a current of taste, later dubbed Romanticism, which began to make itself felt in the second half of the 18th century. Although notoriously difficult to define precisely, this primarily artistic and literary movement found something approaching unity in its indistinctive rejection of the regular and predictable, the harmonious and the overly cerebral aspects of neoclassicism, prizing irregularity in beauty and quirkiness in architecture, as it emphasized the importance of feeling over the intellect in poetry, painting, and music, whereas the philosophes who drew inspiration from ancient Greek and Rome believed in the universality of good taste, delighting to demonstrate the mathematical logic of the rules of proportion or to find satisfaction in the symmetrical. Romantics found Enlightenment rationalism, like neoclassical aesthetics, shallow and inadequate. Increasingly, they turned to the barbarous Middle Ages to recover the importance of awe, mystery, and the sublime. Edmund Burke's philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, 1756, made the case for the power of awe in aesthetic appreciation, while Horace Walpole's estate of Strawberry Hill in Twickenham, a medievalist folly complete with a resident hermit to surprise guests on tours of its deliberately wild landscape, offered an early experiment in its fulfillment. The high point of Romanticism was to coincide with the early years and immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, but the beginnings of the dissatisfaction with the dominance of reason, which it represented, began to be expressed in a number of disciplines from about the middle of the 18th century. In the last quarter of the century, even some philosophers began to expose what they saw as the fallacies of enlightened thinking. The Scottish thinker David Hume's posthumously published Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, 1779, followed the deists' empirical methods with a remorseless logic which exposed the limitations of reason, effectively undermining the intellectual foundations of natural religion. The inadequacies of rational religion could also be grasped from Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, 1789, which stressed the inadequacies of reason alone to establish the central tenets of Christianity, as natural religion was increasingly felt to offer only one part of religious truth, and to ignore too many aspects of human sentiment and imagination. A new stress began to be placed on religious feeling as a proper concern of the faithful. Criticisms of rational religion, which were presented over the course of the 18th century, first by orthodox defenders of tradition, then by sects, claiming the authority of private religious experience, and finally by the most thoroughgoing of the philosophical skeptics, all combined to cast doubt on the complacent arguments for the inherent reasonableness and universality of enlightened Christianity, which had set the tone of polite religion for about 100 years. Methodists, Jansenists, Pietists, Romantics, and even some philosophers suggested that reason could not account for all aspects of human motivation, establish all forms of knowledge, or offer unassailable safeguards of religious truth. The final hammer blow, which was to discredit the Enlightenment approach to Christianity, however, did not appear in the form of a religious pamphlet, a philosophical treatise, or even an open-air sermon, but rather through the shocking events of the French Revolution. Revolution and reaction. Nothing was ever to be quite the same after the French Revolution. Although it had begun rather in the spirit of a 17th century civil war, as a protest against tyrannical excesses of the government of the day, it soon emerged as a movement whose avowed aim was to revolutionize European society. In the development from constitutional monarchy to republic, from civil war to terror, and from the dictatorship of the Directorate to the empire of Napoleon I, virtually no aspect of the Ancien regime was left untouched. Aspects of traditional society as fundamental as political organization, social place, and attitudes toward the church, each representing a pillar of the established order, had all been challenged or actually overturned. Even the familiar way of ordering time was suspended for several years when the Gregorian calendar, which marked time from Christ's birth, was replaced with a new revolutionary calendar, which dated the years from 22 September 1792, the day of the proclamation of the First French Republic. Not content with overthrowing the social and political order at home, the French Jacobins also exported their ideology abroad, giving confidence to would-be revolutionaries throughout the continent and spreading Enlightenment propaganda with their armies. The French Revolution brought to pass every possible nightmare which might have been dreamed up by even the most alarmist 18th century conservative. Monasteries and convents had been forcibly suppressed, and mock religious processions, complete with republicans dressed up as monks or priests and leading mitred donkeys, had paraded through the streets. Priests had been forced to swear oaths of loyalty to a puppet church. Those who refused had been imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Hundreds of faithful lay Catholics had been drowned, stabbed, lynched, or guillotined. A spurious religion of humanity, complete with blasphemous temples to reason and liberty, or to an abstracted supreme being, had for a time been put in the place of traditional Catholic worship. The revolutionary government had even gone so far as to substitute its own martyrs of liberty for canonized saints, to replace the Christian Sabbath with the 10th day or decadi, and to set up rational civil ceremonies of marriage and divorce, which undermined the sacrament of holy matrimony. Even after the worst of the terror and de-Christianization campaigns had subsided, and Napoleon I had made his formal reconciliation with the Catholic Church in the Concordat of 1801, the possibility of calm discussion between defenders of the Church and enlightened skeptics had been irrevocably damaged. The immediate reaction of governments throughout Europe after Napoleon's defeat by the allied British, Prussian, and Belgian Dutch forces at Waterloo was to seek to reverse the spirit as well as many of the practical results of the revolution. This policy, exemplified by the peace settlement drawn up at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, remained the favored political solution until repeated revolutions, first in France in 1830 and then in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, France, Poland, and most parts of the Habsburg Empire in 1848, gradually drove home the point that conservative reaction was not necessarily the best safeguard of stability. But in the decades immediately following the French defeat, when even moderate reform appeared inherently dangerous to many, ultra-conservatives seemed to be trying to return the whole of the continent to some idealized point in time before the storming of the Bastille, while governments attempted to maintain the new status quo as established by the Vienna settlement. It was to maintain a balance between what were seen as the twin extremes of ultra-reaction and revolutionary sentiment that monarchies explicitly linked to churches were restored in 1815. The Catholic and Bourbon king Louis XVIII, returning to the French throne, and Pope Pius VII being restored as ruler of the Papal States. Both Pius VII and his Secretary of State, Ercole Consalvi, while anxious to undo the worst excesses of the French Revolution, were determined not to give in to the most reactionary elements in the papal court, the Zelanti. Many monasteries and convents were restored, and the particularly contentious Jesuit order was formally reconstituted. The notion that a firmer alliance between throne and altar would prevent the recurrence of revolution became a platitude among those who upheld the Vienna settlement, but seemed to would-be progressives to represent a regression from Enlightenment ideals of religious toleration and internationalism. In Prussia, the Reformed and Lutheran churches were brought together to form a single evangelical church supported by the state in 1817. In Britain, which had escaped revolution though not war, pressure for reform, whether in church or state, was delayed for years. When the first politically unavoidable concession came in the shape of the Catholic Emancipation Bill of 1829, it was taken as a reluctant ministerial decision to avert civil war in Ireland. European clergymen and aristocrats who had fancied themselves advanced thinkers or had dabbled in Enlightenment philosophy until the shocks of the French regicide, the expulsion of the clergy, or the Reign of Terror had grown disillusioned with progressivism. They now gave their wholehearted support to established churches and royalist regimes as the bedrock of their security and the protectors of their deepest social, political, and religious values. In this new climate, atheism and anti-clericalism could no longer be seen as legitimate topics for learned debate or light-hearted repartee. They had become politically subversive as well as heretical. The revolutionary slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity, along with the related ideas that human beings are innately reasonable and entitled to natural rights, could hardly continue to resonate among the privileged as they had in the years of pre-revolutionary innocence. A safer course for the preservation of society now seemed to many to lie in the legal protection of a single state church, in the curbing of the press, in the exclusion of social inferiors from the franchise, and in the barring of religious dissenters from holding political office. Salutary doses of dogmatic theology, with the emphasis firmly placed on the unregenerate nature of fallen man and the Christian duty of civil obedience, seemed more appropriate lessons for society at large than the utopian pipe dreams of the philosophies. A comparable reaction to that which took place in the political sphere could be detected in the religious message which began to be preached in most European churches and insisted upon by many ordinary Christians. In northern Germany, the Protestant revivalist movement known as the Awakening rejected both the Enlightenment and the French Revolution as works of the devil. The message was equally well preached by Joseph de Maistre, whose Considerations sur la France, 1796, made the same point on behalf of Catholic priests who had suffered exile, assault, or imprisonment during the Revolutionary years. Natural religion, dismissed by many as little more than an intellectual assent to an abstraction, hardly seemed an appropriate response to the realization of the depth of human sin and the miracle of Christ's redeeming sacrifice on the cross. Among Protestants, early calls to the devout life included those of the German evangelical Friedrich Schleiermacher, whose Reden über die Religion, on religion, speeches to its cultured despisers, 1799, called the genteel sophisticates of European society to turn back from those enlightened religions to the despised positive religions, where everything real, powerful, and determinate appears. Rigorous Protestant groups like the Methodists in Britain, who had seemed beyond the pale of polite Georgian society, became more socially acceptable in the general climate of evangelical revival. Indeed, some members of the new denomination thought too much social and theological radicalism was being compromised in the process of integration and left to form new Methodist communions. The Independents broke away in 1805, the Primitives in 1810, and the Bible Christians in 1815, partly because they wished to preserve such unconventional features of the early movement as an itinerant ministry, preaching by women, and love feasts or open-air revivalists' meetings. The view that rational theology was inadequate to express the felt truths of Revelation was equally widely popularized in Catholic circles. An early work by François René, Vicomte de Chateaubriand, entitled The Genius of Christianity, or the Beauties of the Christian Religion, 1802, presented the Catholic Church as both the repository of Christian truth and the safeguard of European civilization. Felicity Robert de Lamennais' Reflections on the State of the Church of 1808 warned that solitary contemplation could only lead to atheism. As he elaborated in his best-selling Essai sur Indifference, 1817, the state could not be indifferent to religion, since it was only through obedience to the teaching of the Catholic Church that the individual could be saved from error, a lesson reiterated in De Maistre's pro-papal tract on the Pope of 1819. In France, Italy, southern Germany, Prussia, and elsewhere, thousands of ordinary Catholics chose to pursue the religious life in one of many reopened or newly established religious houses. The number of nuns involved in teaching and charitable activities in France alone doubled during the period between the Restoration and the Revolution of 1830, rising from about 12,500 sisters in 1814 to 25,000 in 1830. A new kind of Christian apologetic, born out of reaction to the Revolution, set the tone of conservative orthodoxy for most of the 19th century. This tone was at once more dogmatic and emotive than the rational religion which had dominated the established churches in the 18th century. It not only followed the Romantics in placing feeling above what was now discredited as cold logic, but also focused attention on the personal relationship believed to exist between God and the believer as an antidote to what was seen as the religious indifference of the previous age. Formerly unfashionable 18th century works which stressed the importance of religious feelings, like the non-juror William Law's Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life, 1728, or which pointed to the futility of attempting to deduce revelation directly from nature, like Joseph Butler's The Analogy of Religion, Natural and Revealed, to the Constitution and Course of Nature, 1736, were now revived by Protestants. The Anglican clergyman Charles Simeon's 1759 through 1836 emotive sermons on themes drawn from religious experience made a lasting impression on generations of ordinands at the University of Cambridge and helped to spread the new religious tone throughout the Church of England. In Germany, Schleiermacher and others advocated a return to the native pietist tradition to renew faith, since the proud islanders of Britain, whose zeal for the sciences, for the wisdom of life, and for holy freedom is merely an empty sham battle, seemed nearly as morally bankrupt as the French, whose sight the lover of religion can hardly bear, for in every act and every word they all but trample on its most holy laws. Protestant groups which proclaimed an evangelical message and acknowledged the validity of dramatic conversion experiences, sometimes accompanied by extraordinary manifestations of the Holy Spirit, such as speaking in tongues or being miraculously healed, swelled in membership. Evangelically minded laymen with national churches, like those in Prussia and Germany, who had absorbed Schleiermacher's message, or the religiously earnest group who formed London's influential Clapham sect, or Hackney phalanx, began to move from the periphery to the center of respectable religion, influencing the characteristic expression of religiosity even in high society. As one English lady noted in 1828, the doctrines called evangelical make all the noise now. Or as Lord Melbourne complained to Queen Victoria in 1837, nobody is gay now, they are so religious. As enthusiastic reappropriations of religion became more socially acceptable in polite circles, pressures for reform came to be instinctively resisted by most established churchmen. It was a year after the passage of the Great Reform Bill of 1832 in England, for example, that a group of Anglican clergymen at the University of Oxford, alarmed by the prospect of governmental interference in church affairs, began to launch a series of pamphlets on religious subjects known as Tracts for the Times. The inventions of these tractarians in what came to be known as the Oxford movement was to protect the Church of England from reform by affirming its claims to authority as given in the 39 Articles, a series of doctrinal statements which constituted the post-Reformation theology of the Anglican Church. They soon discovered that the 39 Articles were neither clearly Protestant nor formally Catholic, but offered what was in effect a compromise position between the twin extremes of 16th century Calvinism and Catholicism. In seeking to make the Articles appear internally consistent, the Tractarians increasingly stressed their Catholic rather than their Protestant legacy, thus reopening old theological controversies and alienating both evangelical and liberal groups within the established church. The growing suspicion that the Tractarians were crypto-Catholics appeared to be borne out when one of the leaders of the movement, John Henry Newman, published his celebrated Tract 90, 1841, which argued that the 39 Articles were patient of a Catholic interpretation. Newman's conversion to Catholicism in 1845, along with a number of other prominent Tractarians, shattered the confidence of the Oxford movement and left the Church of England fractionalized into mutually mistrustful evangelical, Anglo-Catholic, and liberal or broad church groupings whose public disputes helped to undermine the church's credibility. The validity of direct religious experience tempered by doctrinal authority was emphasized with as much fervor in Catholic as in Protestant circles. Claims of miracles, which in the pre-revolutionary period had been liable to be loudly ridiculed as relics of a superstitious past, were afterwards seen in a very different light. When a nun called Catherine Labour had a vision of the Virgin Mary at her home in the Rue du Bac in Paris, the very city which had launched the revolution, she was neither pilloried in the press nor despised as the deluded tool of priests. Rather, the vision of what she saw, of the Virgin shedding light on a penitent world above a caption reading, "O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee," seemed an uncannily apposite call to repentance and prayer. The vision was engraved on a medal which was first struck in France in 1832 and widely distributed from 1834. Many claimed mysterious healings, especially of cholera, from this miraculous medal. A second apparition of the Virgin Mary to two young cowherds near the French alpine village of La Salette in 1846, although afterwards discredited, helped to prepare popular opinion to accept a number of further 19th century apparitions. The most enduring and renowned of these visions were those which took place at Lourdes in 1858, but over the course of the century, Marian apparitions were claimed in virtually every country which boasted a Catholic population. Among the more celebrated were those which were said to have taken place at Pont-Main, France in 1817, Marpingen, Germany, and Pompeii, Italy in 1876, Mettenbuch, Germany in 1877, Knock, Ireland in 1879, and Tilly-sur-Seulles, France, from 1896 to 1899. The pattern was to continue throughout the 20th century, some of the more famous apparitions taking place at Fatima in Portugal in 1917, at Ezquioga in the Spanish Pyrenees in 1931, at Bereng 1932, and Benno 1933 in Belgium, at Pfaffenhofen in Germany in 1945 through 46, and at Medjugorje in Yugoslavia, Bosnia in 1981. This ends part 2.